February 19th marks yet another major anniversary for The Legend of Zelda, now weighing in at 30 years and still going strong. And as such, it's only appropriate that we look at something Zelda related today. Let's look at a game of highs and lows, good ideas and bad, light and dark. Today, I'm talking about Twilight Princess. It'll actually be Twilight Princess's 10th anniversary later this year. It feels like it wasn't that long ago, hearing about that now legendary reaction to the reveal, and that exciting feeling that you only really get as a child, going to the store to find that long-awaited game. Now here I am years later popping in that old GameCube disc for the first time in ages, so let's see how it holds up. When you think Zelda, you generally think action, adventure, solving puzzles, exploring dungeons, finding treasure, stuff like that. But that's not generally what people talk about, except with Twilight Princess. See, Twilight Princess starts slow. Even knowing exactly what to do, it was still 3 hours before I found myself in the first dungeon of the game. Before that, you'll be chatting with villagers, finding cats, herding goats, and showing off your slingshot and sword skills. The whole intro is a bloated tutorial, and for some people that can be the breaking point. I actually like it. The tutorials are pretty pointless and time-consuming, but the mood is great. Most Zelda games start off with a legend being told to you, set to some austere music, and visualized with some stained glass or something. Twilight Princess still starts with a legend, but it's told to you casually by your sword instructor while you're sitting at a spring. The whole thing is done with no music, just the sounds of text scrolling and the environment around you. The scene is set to a mellow orange sunset, and that's the word I'd use to describe this entire game. Mellow. Not dark and edgy, not realistic, not unsettling. Everything about the game screams at you to relax. The difficulty isn't very high. The sound design also pushes this mellowness. The harsh synthetic sounds of previous Zelda games are replaced with more low-key notes, more like a guitar strum. And while the game's music is definitely still very melodic, there's a very definite push towards atmosphere, and the game uses a very muted palette. Not grey and brown like some people might have you believe, but generally using darker colors. Honestly, making the game any brighter would probably kind of ruin the game's feel, at least to me. Speaking of dark colors, this is by far the most realistic graphical style a Zelda game has ever gone for, and as a result it's the most grounded Zelda game to date. Not that that's saying much. What this lends itself to is lots of detail, something I definitely appreciated more through older eyes. Houses and dungeons are overflowing with unnecessary detail, whether it's mechanical elements showing how a machine works, support structures showing how large buildings can exist, or the scattered belongings of whoever's house you're invading. Unfortunately, with that realistic style comes the most flat and barren interpretation of Hyrule Field in the franchise's history. There are things to find, but getting there will involve walking in a straight line for a while. Doing a full lap of Hyrule Field on foot will take multiple in-game days, and one day-night cycle in Twilight Princess is about 24 minutes. So yeah. Luckily the game unlocks the ability to warp from location to location pretty early on, so you'll only be trekking through this massive empty world a few times. Travel time is also cut down pretty significantly once you get your horse. However, the overall design of Hyrule Field can be seen as symbolic of a lot of this game's flaws. Namely, that there's good stuff at the end, but lots of padding to get there. Even though this game has more dungeons than most Zeldas, it also has a lot of filler content in between each one. Besides one particularly egregious case near the end of the game, this filler content isn't that bad though. It has a lot of action and contributes to the story, and the story itself is significantly less flawed. Twilight Princess, by Zelda standards, is very plot heavy, as in, there's lots of cutscenes. But if that's not your jam, that's fine. This was the first and last Zelda game to introduce a cutscene skipping feature. But really, unless you're a gameplay purist, I don't think there's a reason to skip this story. It's pretty enjoyable following what would become fan favorite character Midna, and fighting against the Kylo Ren of Zelda villains, Zant. It also has a pinch of moral ambiguity to it. Unlike in most Zelda games where you collect magic pendants or Triforce pieces or something like that, you're collecting cursed artifacts that have vaguely defined dark powers. I mean, just compare the jingle that plays when you collect an item like this in any other Zelda game. And then the one in Twilight Princess. The main story is decent enough, but what's cool is there's a lot of optional background detail too. Every time you beat a dungeon, time progresses. And if you take the time to backtrack to places you've been on your adventure, you can keep up to date with the people you've met. Usually they're moving along with their own plans that will come up later in the story, or reacting to something you've accomplished on your journey. I really love this. It makes it feel like I'm actually impacting the world, compared to the largely static dialogue of other Zelda games, or even just other games in general. But enough talk of stories and filler. The real appeal of Twilight Princess is the amazing dungeons. I've gotta say, this game is worth experiencing just for these dungeons. These are some of the best temples in the franchise, helped in part by the fact that they're not all just temples. You've got some pretty creative settings, the best one being a mountaintop mansion. Even traditional tropes like grass, fire, or water themed levels have new life breathed into them in this game. The dungeons are all well designed with cool puzzles, and each one has something distinct about it, whether you're leading a golem down a tower, getting water flowing to fill a central chamber, or collecting soup ingredients. They're further helped by an all-star cast of Zelda items. There are some new ones, like the spinner, which is basically an ancient hoverboard, and the ball and chain, longtime bane of the existence of every Zelda player, can now be taken and used against your enemies. But the game also introduces variation to classic items. Your boomerang does everything a normal boomerang does in Zelda, but now it also can create tornadoes. The metal boots let you magnetically walk on the walls and ceilings of certain surfaces very, very slowly. But the best one by far is the upgrade to the hookshot. Its new form is 2 hookshots, which basically makes you Skulltula Man. In fact, if there's any downside to all these items, it's that the game is so packed with content that it feels like nothing was really used to its full potential. Like that hoverboard I just mentioned, the spinner. It's used exactly 2 times outside of a dungeon. Part of the reason for that is because there just aren't that many incentives to use your items. Since this game has so many dungeons, it has lots of bosses, and thus it has lots of heart containers. That means there's not a lot of places for heart pieces. To help combat this slightly, they've now made it so that you need 5 heart pieces instead of the usual 4 to make a new heart container. But what this ends up doing is making progress seem even slower in an already very big game, and it's still not really enough. This is definitely part of the game where it starts to slump. Its side content is just subpar. First of all, there just isn't very much of it, but also the rewards for a lot of them are money. Not only that, but you'll be finding plenty of chests full of large sums of rupees as well. This might not be a problem, except that you start the game with a wallet that can hold a paltry 300 rupees. You can double that just before the 3rd dungeon, but it'll be near the end of the game before you can get the biggest wallet, and even then it can only hold 1,000 rupees. Even then, all this is rendered moot because there's not much to spend money on in this game. In terms of situations where you need money to progress, there's buying a slingshot, buying bombs, and very late in the game you need to pay 300 rupees to access a dungeon. In terms of optional stuff, you can buy a targeting reticule for your bow and arrow, donate to a charity until you accumulate 1,000 rupees in donations, then you'll get a heart piece, and by donating 1,200 rupees to a different place, you can open up a store. What does this store give you? Discounts on items you'll never buy, and also it gives you access to the magic armor. This is an awful reward because what it does is drain rupees in order to make you invincible. It drains them incredibly fast, so it's not very useful, since you can't get rupees fast enough to keep it maintained, and your wallet's so small that it's pointless. But also, it makes an easy game that much easier. The problem with rewards continues, since the 2 biggest quests in the game reward you with, you guessed it, money. Collect all 24 bugs in Hyrule and you'll get 150 rupees per pair you bring in. But that's nothing compared to the biggest pain of them all, Poe hunting. This quest is awful. There are 60 Poes hidden somewhere in the world. There's no way to know where, and there's no way to keep track of which ones you've taken care of already. But it gets worse. They only come out at night. As I mentioned earlier, a day in Hyrule is 24 minutes. That means you only have 12 minutes to hunt for Poes before they disappear. Then you have to wait 12 unskippable minutes to be able to get them again. So what's your reward for going through the trouble of doing all this? 200 rupees. Every time you ask for it. So infinite money. Yay! There are side activities you can do to get extra bomb bags, bigger quiver, that kind of thing, but these are just small diversions. There is one final major side quest, the Cave of Ordeals. It sees you fighting wave after wave of enemies, and it's doing this challenge that makes me realize the game isn't quite as slick mechanically as I wish it was. The hitboxes for some enemies are way off, and you just don't really have the mobility you need for some of these situations. The camera doesn't do you any favors at times either. So what is your reward for conquering floor after floor of enemies? Well, first of all, at regular intervals, you'll find yourself interrupted by a character that looks like she's straight out of Hyrule Warriors. As you get deeper into the cave, she'll release fairies at different springs across the world. Since you can automatically warp to almost all of these springs, but not the final one, this reward becomes pointless after the first one you unlock. Beating every single floor gives you a potion that can fully heal you and will double your damage for a few seconds. And for some reason you can only take one at a time. Finally, it's not exactly a side quest, but there's an optional key you can get in the final dungeon. What does this unlock? A room with even more money! So yeah, optional stuff in Twilight Princess? Do it for the journey, because you're not going to get much out of it. That's not to say the main game doesn't have flaws. I already talked about the overly long intro, but Twilight Princess puts its worst foot forward in a lot of ways. Preceding the first 3 dungeons of the game are segments where you enter parts of Hyrule covered in twilight. While you're in the twilight, you're transformed into a wolf and made to collect tears of light from weird bug things. This is a heavily criticized part of the game, and I don't quite get it. Maybe if the bugs weren't clearly marked on your map, but as it stands, what it serves to do is have you explore an area with limited abilities before being able to come back with your full arsenal as a human. There are also only 3 of these segments in the entire game, and as I said, it's a big game. Despite all the defense I just gave it, it's a weaker element of Twilight Princess, and the fact that they're all front-loaded contributes to Twilight Princess's weak opening. The wolf form also isn't that great. Besides one ability you get pretty early on, what you start off with is all you get. There's absolutely no evolution, no new items or abilities in any capacity. It reaches a point where the game will eventually use turning into a wolf as a punishment. And despite that, a pretty essential power is locked behind the wolf form for no real reason. See, for some reason, you can only use Midna's warp ability to get from place to place when you're in wolf form. What this means is there's inevitably a little bit of inconvenience every time you want to go somewhere because you have to transform back to a human. Speaking of human, your non-wolf form is about what you'd expect. Due to the more realistic tone, your sword slashes and combat in general just aren't as flashy as they were in Wind Waker. But they get around this a bit by having a whole bunch of unlockable abilities for you to learn. Besides the finishing blow, the first one, which you get automatically, none of these are required and thus they're not used very thoroughly against enemies, but they can make things a bit easier. Well, some of them can. I found myself struggling to find a use for a few. The coolest thing is definitely that it lets you use the parry moves from Wind Waker freely. In particular, the anime jump slash you can use on your opponent's head is super satisfying. The game also added, for the first time and last time, the ability to slash while running. It's pretty weak and not useful for much, but just being able to do it makes the game feel smoother. There's also a tiny, completely unnecessary detail, where if you sheath your sword right after you beat an enemy, you'll do a fancy little flourish. Twilight Princess is full of tiny details like these. For example, in a dungeon, the first time you open a door, you'll dislodge some debris. Not only is this great attention to detail, but it also helps you keep track of which doors you've been through already. The expertly composed music has a cool dynamic layer to it too. A lot of battle themes will change depending on what's going on in the fight. Most notably during boss fights, when you have the upper hand, a heroic little theme will start playing. This is such a cool, empowering moment, and it should be a staple of the franchise. There's also lots of little tweaks that just make sense. For example, a fairy won't automatically heal you if you're at full health. That makes it easier to catch in a bottle and make sure they don't go to waste. And there's this surprisingly in-depth little mini-game you can play by looking at a background object. Just because. The more time I spent with Twilight Princess, the more I appreciated the care that clearly went into this game. There are definitely Zeldas I enjoy more than it, but it was a lot better than I remembered. And I already remembered it being great. So, if you haven't played this, or if this review inspired you to give it another go, you might be wondering what options you have to get your hands on this game. Well, a GameCube copy is pretty rare, but as some of you might know, there's a way to play this on the Wii U. That's right, for a pretty low price, you can get yourself a copy of the Wii version of the game. It's functionally the same, just with added widescreen support, and motion controls for aiming and slashing. Oh, and it's mirrored. Thanks for watching. Feel free to leave a comment of courage, wisdom, or power below. But also, if you liked this video, and want to see something more in the general Zelda anniversary spirit, check out People Like Zelda by Convex. I also can't recommend enough Twilight Symphony by Zelda Reorchestrated. It's a beautiful take on the game's entire soundtrack, performed by a live orchestra. If you want to see way too many comments about the value of an HD port, you can follow me at HatTalkTalk on Twitter. And with all that said, see you next time.